Settle in, if you will. Find that comfortable place where the world outside fades to a soft murmur. Perhaps you are lying in bed, the covers pulled up to your chin, the only light a small lamp on the nightstand. Or maybe you are stretched out on a couch, the room cool and dim. That is perfect. This is a story for the quiet hour, the moment when the day's noise has drifted away and your mind can wander like a slow river. We are going to step back together more than 150 years, to a time when the world moved at a different pace. A time of gas lamps and horse-drawn carriages, of wooden sidewalks and chimneys that breathed smoke into the evening sky. And we are going to talk about a night that changed everything, a night when a great city burned. But do not worry. This is not a story to keep you awake with fear. It is a story to carry you along, to let you drift through the embers and the ash, to see the glow from a safe distance. It is a sleepy tale, a gentle history, like a grandfather telling you about the old days by the fire. So close your eyes if you like. Listen to the sound of my voice. Let it be a lullaby, and I will take you to Chicago in the autumn of 187 on. The city of Chicago in that year was a place of furious energy. It had grown so fast, so recklessly, that it seemed to stretch out in every direction like a young man who had not yet learned to sit still. In 1830, it was a small trading post with a few dozen souls living in log cabins by the shore of Lake Michigan. By 1871, it was a metropolis of 300,000 people, the fastest-growing city in America, a jumble of grain elevators and stockyards, of mansions and tenements, all thrown together along the muddy banks of the Chicago River. It was a city of wood. That is the first thing to understand. Almost everything was built from timber. The houses, the stores, the factories, even the sidewalks and the streets themselves in many parts were made of pine and oak, sawn from the great forests of Michigan and Wisconsin. The city sat on wooden pilings driven into the swampy ground. The roads were often planks laid over mud. The buildings were painted and decorated, but underneath they were dry tinder, waiting for a spark. And it had been a terribly dry summer. That is the second thing. From July through September, hardly any rain had fallen. The air was parched. The grass in the parks turned brown and brittle. The wooden shingles on the roofs curled and cracked in the sun. The city's water supply, drawn from the lake, was limited, and the fire department, though brave and hardworking, was not equipped for a blaze of any great size. They had horse-drawn steam pumpers, yes, and hose carts, and a handful of firemen who knew their business. But they relied on the city's water mains, and those mains were old and insufficient. A small fire could be handled. A big fire on a dry and windy night was a different matter. Now let us set the scene for the evening of Sunday, October 8th, 1871. The sun had set around 5:30 p.m., and a warm, southerly wind was blowing, gentle at first but growing stronger as the night wore on. The streets were quiet. Many people had gone to church that evening, and others were home with their families, enjoying the last of the weekend. The city was dark, lit only by gas lamps that cast pools of yellow light on the dusty roads. The lake lay to the east, black and vast, with small waves lapping against the shore. It was a peaceful night, the kind of night that makes you think of nothing in particular, just the simple comfort of being indoors. But in a small neighborhood on the west side of the city, near the corner of DeKoven and Jefferson Streets, something was happening that would soon shatter that peace. There was a barn behind a cottage, a modest wooden building where a family kept a cow and a few other animals. The family was named O'Leary. Patrick O'Leary worked as a laborer, and his wife Catherine took in washing to help make ends meet. They were Irish immigrants like so many in Chicago, living a simple, hard-working life. Their barn was small, maybe 12 feet by 18, filled with hay and straw for the cow. And around 8:30 p.m., something caught fire in that barn. There is an old story, one that has been told so many times it has become a kind of legend, that the fire was started by a cow kicking over a lantern. The story says that Catherine O'Leary was milking the cow, and the animal, perhaps startled by something, lashed out and knocked the lantern into the hay. It is a vivid image, a cow with a vengeful hoof, a sudden burst of flame. And while it makes for a good tale, historians are not certain it is true. Catherine O'Leary herself denied it for the rest of her life. She said she was in bed early that night, tired from her work, and the barn was locked. No one knows for sure how the fire began. Perhaps it was a stray spark from a chimney, or a carelessly discarded match, or even a small boy sneaking a smoke in the shadows. The truth is lost to time. But what we know for certain is that the fire started in that barn, and it spread with a speed that no one expected. The wooden barn was dry as a bone. The hay inside was like crumpled paper. The wind, blowing from the south, caught the flames and pushed them toward the O'Leary cottage and the neighboring houses. Within minutes, the barn was a roaring torch. The fire leaped to the cottage, then to the next building and the next, running along the wooden fences and the dry grass. The fire department was called. The alarm went out at about 8:45 p.m., and the firemen, who had just returned from fighting a smaller fire the night before, scrambled to harness their horses and roll out their engines. They were exhausted. The previous evening, a fire had burned for hours in a lumber yard on the west side, destroying several blocks before it was finally contained. The men had not slept well. Their equipment was tired, their horses were tired, and now they faced a new challenge, one that would quickly grow beyond anything they had ever seen. The first engine to arrive was from a station not far away. The firemen hooked up their hoses to a fire hydrant, but they found that the water pressure was weak. The flames were already spreading too fast. The wind was picking up, turning from a breeze into a gale, and it carried burning embers high into the air. Those embers, some as large as a man's hand, floated over the heads of the firefighters and landed on rooftops blocks away. New fires erupted everywhere. It was like a rain of fire, soft and terrible, falling on the wooden city. Within an hour, the blaze was no longer a single fire. It was a multitude of fires, all feeding each other, merging into a massive wall of flame that marched north and east, driven by that relentless wind. And here is where the story takes on a strange, dreamlike quality. In the chaos of that night, there were moments of calm, of almost absurd normalcy. Some people, when they first saw the glow in the sky, thought it was the moon rising red and swollen. Others simply went back to their dinners, assuming the fire department would handle it. The theaters, which were full that evening, let out their audiences at the usual hour, and the crowd stepped into streets that were suddenly bright with an orange light. They saw the flames climbing in the distance, but still, many walked home slowly, not yet understanding. It took time for the reality to sink in. The fire was not just a fire, it was a storm. Imagine, if you will, what it must have looked like. The sky turned scarlet, then a deep, angry copper. The air filled with smoke and cinders, stinging the eyes and catching in the throat. The wind roared, not like a storm from the lake, but like a furnace, hot and dry, carrying the sound of crackling wood and collapsing buildings. The streets were soon clogged with people, some carrying bundles of clothes, others pushing carts piled high with furniture, some leading horses or driving cattle ahead of them. Everywhere there was the sound of shouting, of crying, of bells ringing from the church towers, of horses whinnying in panic. And above it all, the fire itself, a living thing, hungry and patient, eating its way through block after block. It is remarkable how many small stories survive from that night. There is the tale of a man who tried to save his piano, only to abandon it in the middle of the street when the heat became unbearable. The piano sat there, playing its own mournful notes as the fire neared, until it too was consumed. There is the story of a woman who grabbed a feather bed and a cage of canaries, and nothing else, and ran through the smoke until she reached the lake, where she sat in the shallows, watching the city burn. There is the story of a young boy who was separated from his family and wandered for hours, only to find them again at dawn, standing on a sand dune, covered in soot. These fragments, these little human moments, are the things that make the history feel real, not just dates and numbers, but people trying to hold onto what mattered to them. As the night deepened, the fire grew into something truly monstrous. It was not just one fire now. It was a firestorm. The heat became so intense that it created its own weather. Superheated air rose in a great column, and cool air rushed in from below, making the wind even stronger. The flames leaped from block to block, jumping over streets and canals as if they were nothing. The bridge across the Chicago River, a wooden drawbridge, caught fire and burned, cutting off the south side from the north. People ran to the river, hoping the water would block the flames, but the fire simply jumped, carried by the wind and the flying embers. The downtown district, with its grand hotels, its department stores, its opera houses, all of it was devoured. The courthouse, a massive stone building that everyone thought was fireproof, burned from the inside out. The roof collapsed. The great bell in the tower, which had been ringing the alarm, fell and cracked. It is said that the sound of that bell, the last clang before it shattered, could be heard above the roar of the fire. And all through this, the common people of Chicago, The laborers and the shopkeepers, the immigrants and the natives, they did what they could. Some fought the fire with buckets, knowing it was hopeless. Others dug trenches, trying to create fire breaks by demolishing buildings in the path of the flames. One man, a grocer named Jacob, took a shotgun and shot at the city water tower, hoping to release the water from the tank. He missed, but someone else eventually blew it open with gunpowder. The water poured into the streets, but it was gone before it could do much good. The fire was too big, too powerful. It seemed like a force of nature, a terrible judgment descending on the city. Now the hour is late, and we have only begun to walk through that night. The fire would burn for many more hours, all through the night and into the morning of October 9th, and it would not stop until it had consumed more than 3 square miles of the city, leaving 100,000 people homeless and destroying nearly 18,000 buildings. But we are not there yet. We are still in the early hours around 10 o'clock when the fire was just beginning to show its full strength. The wind is still blowing, the flames are still marching, and the people of Chicago are still hoping, against all hope, that something will stop it. Let us pause here in this moment of uncertainty. Lie still and listen to the crackle in the distance. The night is long and the fire has a long way to go. We will follow it a little further when you are ready. For now, let the warmth of the story settle around you like a blanket. The city is burning, but you are safe here in the quiet dark, and the tale will wait for you. Now, let us settle deeper into the dark. Let the fire glow on the horizon become a distant memory for a moment. We will pick up the thread of the story again, but slowly, gently, like turning a page in a very old book. You are still here, warm and comfortable, and the tale will unfold at its own pace, like smoke drifting through a quiet room. The hour moves past 10 o'clock. The fire has been burning for more than an hour, and it has already consumed several blocks. The firemen are still trying, but their efforts are scattered like water thrown into the wind. The water pressure continues to fail. The hoses run dry. The men stand in the streets, watching the flames climb higher, and they know in their hearts that this is not a fire they can fight. It is a fire they must survive. And yet, even in the midst of such despair, there are moments of strange courage. There is the story of a young man named Edward, a clerk in a hardware store, who saw the fire from his window and decided he would not simply run. He gathered as many buckets as he could carry, filled them with water from the pump in his backyard, and began to wet down the wooden fence that separated his house from the neighbor's. He worked alone, pouring water on the dry boards, watching the steam rise as the heat from the approaching fire made the water sizzle. He did this for nearly an hour, until the flames were so close that his eyebrows were singed and his hands blistered. And then, when the fire finally reached his street, he gave up, grabbed his mother's arm, and ran. His house burned, of course. But the small act of trying, the stubborn refusal to give up until the last moment, that is what stays in the memory. There are many such stories. They are the quiet stories, the ones that do not make the newspapers, but they are the ones that people tell their grandchildren. There is the story of a baker named Hans who lived near the O'Leary barn. He smelled smoke, stepped outside and saw the glow. He did not run. Instead, he went back inside his shop, took all the loaves of bread he had baked that day, and loaded them into a wheelbarrow. He pushed that wheelbarrow through the smoke, through the panic, all the way to the lake, where he gave the bread to families who were standing in the water with nothing but the clothes on their backs. He did not tell anyone his name. He simply vanished into the crowd after the last loaf was given away. A small kindness, a small warmth in a night of fire. And then there is the strange, almost comical story of the city jail. The jail was a sturdy brick building, thought to be fireproof. Inside were about a dozen prisoners, locked in their cells, listening to the shouts and the crackling outside. The guards, unsure of what to do, eventually decided to release the prisoners rather than let them burn. But the prisoners did not run. Some of them, it is said, refused to leave. They said they felt safer inside the stone walls than out in the chaos. One prisoner, a man convicted of stealing a horse, asked the guard if he could finish his supper first. So there they sat in the middle of a burning city, eating a meal of beans and bread, while the fire crept closer. Eventually, the heat became too intense, and the prisoners were forced to leave. They walked out into the streets, still holding their tin plates, and were never seen again. Or perhaps they were seen, but in the confusion, no one asked which way they went. It is a small detail, but it reminds us that even in the darkest hours, there is a hint of absurdity, a reminder that human beings are strange and unpredictable creatures. Now let us drift northward across the river, where the fire is beginning to spread. The bridge is gone, burned and broken, but the flames do not need a bridge. They leap across the water on the wings of the wind. The north side of the city is mostly residential, full of wooden houses and small shops, with narrow streets and alleys. The fire finds this part of the city like a hungry mouth finding a soft piece of bread. It devours block after block. The wind, fresh from the prairie, pushes the flames relentlessly. People abandon their homes with little warning. Some have time to grab a few belongings. Others have only the night clothes they were wearing when the heat woke them. There is a story of a family on the north side, the Millers. Mr. Miller was a carpenter. He had built his own house, a two-story frame structure with a porch and a gabled roof. He was proud of it. When the fire reached his street, he ran upstairs to wake his wife and children. He told them to go to the lake quickly, and he followed behind them, but then he stopped. He turned back. He could not bear to leave his tools. He went into his workshop, gathered his saws, his hammers, his planes, and put them in a wooden chest. He tried to carry the chest, but it was too heavy. So he dragged it across the floor, out the door, down the steps, and into the street. The heat was unbearable. The fire was just a few houses away. He knew he had only minutes. He left the chest in the middle of the street, hoping he could come back for it later, but the chest caught fire and the tools melted into a lump of iron and wood. Mr. Miller found his family at the lake, and he told them the story with a strange laugh. He had saved nothing, but he had tried. And that was something. The lake itself became a refuge. Thousands of people waded into the cold water, standing waist-deep, watching their city burn. The water was calm, but the sky was a riot of color, orange and red and black, with sparks flying like stars falling upward. People held onto each other, onto pieces of driftwood, onto anything that floated. Some stayed in the water for hours until the heat subsided and the fire moved on. It is said that the water was surprisingly warm near the shore, warmed by the heat of the fire. So they stood in a kind of lukewarm bath, surrounded by the roar and the crackle and the cries of the dying city. Let us pause again, just for a moment, to feel that strange juxtaposition. The warmth of the water, the cool night air, the fire raging above. It is a sensory memory that must have been imprinted on every survivor. They would never forget the smell of smoke, the taste of ash, the sound of glass shattering in the heat. But they would also remember the feel of the water, the gentle lapping of waves against their legs, the way the lake seemed to hold them safe. The fire continued to spread through the night. By midnight, it had crossed the river in several places. The downtown area, the business district, was now fully engulfed. The Grand Hotels, the Palmer House and the Sherman House, were burning. The Opera House, where just hours before people had been laughing at a comedy, was a skeleton of iron and stone. The city's pride, the courthouse with its great dome, was a hollow shell. The fire did not discriminate. It burned the rich and the poor, the grand and the humble. It burned the churches and the saloons, the libraries and the brothels. It was an equalizer in the worst possible way. And yet, amid all this destruction, there were stories of survival that seem almost miraculous. There is the tale of a young woman named Mary, who worked as a seamstress in a dress shop on State Street. When the fire began to close in, she ran up to the top floor of the building, hoping to find a way onto the roof. The stairs were already blocked by flames, so she climbed out a window and balanced on a narrow ledge. She held onto the brick wall, pressing her body flat, while the fire raged below. She stayed there for what felt like hours, watching the fire consume the building floor by floor. The heat was so intense that her dress began to smolder. She tore it off and threw it into the street. She was left in her undergarments, clinging to the wall, her skin blistering. And then, just as she thought she would fall, a man on a ladder appeared, reaching out to her. He had climbed up from the roof of a neighboring building. He took her hand, pulled her across the gap, and led her down to safety. She never learned his name. He was just a shadow in the smoke, a hand in the dark. These are the threads that weave the fabric of the story. They are not grand or heroic in the way of epic poems. They are small, but they matter. They are the moments when one person reaches out to another, when a stranger becomes a lifeline, when the human spirit, tired and afraid, still finds a way to keep going. Now, let us move deeper into the night, past midnight, toward the dark hours before dawn. The fire is still burning, but it has begun to slow. Not because anyone has stopped it, but because it has run out of fuel in some places. The wind is dying down. The embers are not flying as far. The fire is still immense, still destructive, but it is no longer a runaway train. It has become a slow, smoldering beast, content to finish what it started. On the south side, a group of firefighters and volunteers had managed, by some miracle, to stop the fire's advance. They had created a firebreak by blowing up buildings with gunpowder, and the fire, for once, did not jump across. It stalled. It chewed at the edges, but it could not push through. The people on the south side, the ones who had not yet fled, began to breathe a little easier. They could still see the glow, but it was no longer moving toward them. And yet, for those on the north side and the west side, the fire was still very much alive. It burned through the night, through the early morning, until the sun rose on a scene of utter devastation. The sun, when it finally appeared, was dim and red, obscured by a thick haze of smoke. The city, or what was left of it, was a smoking ruin. Blocks and blocks of ash and charred wood, with here and there a stone wall still standing, or a chimney pointing to the sky like a finger of accusation. It is hard to imagine what it must have felt like to wake up that morning, if anyone could truly sleep. The survivors who had found shelter in the lake or on the prairie or in the few buildings that remained, they opened their eyes to a world that had been erased. The streets were gone, replaced by hot ash. The landmarks were gone, replaced by twisted metal and broken stone. The familiar sounds of the city, the clatter of carts, the calls of vendors, the laughter of children, all of that was replaced by silence. A heavy, thick silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of a dying ember or the sob of a child. And yet, even in that silence, there was life. People began to move. They came out of the water, shivering and sooty. They gathered on the shore, looking back at the smoldering remains. They began to search for each other, calling out names. They began to salvage what they could, picking through the ashes for anything that had survived. And slowly, tentatively, they began to rebuild. But that is a story for another time, a story of resilience and hope. For now, let us stay in the quiet of the morning after. The fire is out. The danger is past. The city is gone, but the people are still here. They stand in the cold, gray dawn, wrapped in blankets and shock, and they look at each other with eyes that have seen too much. And yet they are still standing. That is the remarkable thing. They are still standing. Let us close our eyes for a moment. Let the scene settle. The smoke is drifting away. The air is cold and clean. The sun is rising, pale and weak, but it is rising. And in that light there is the faintest hint of hope, like a tiny flame that refuses to be extinguished. The story does not end here, not really, but it is enough for now. You have walked through the night, you have seen the fire, you have felt the heat and the fear and the strange moments of grace. Rest now. Let the memory of that night fade into the distance, like the glow on the horizon, until it is nothing more than a dream, a story told in the dark, for the quiet hours before sleep. But the story does continue, because the night was long and the fire had left its mark in ways that took years to fully understand. And as the sun climbed higher on that first morning after, the survivors began to realize that the ordeal was not over. It was, in a way, just beginning. The fire had stopped, yes, but the smoke still hung in the air like a thick blanket, and the ash still drifted down like gray snow. And the silence, that heavy, unnatural silence, was still pressing down on everything. Let us imagine what it was like to walk through the streets that morning. Or rather, what had been streets. The wooden planks that had covered the mud were gone, burned away, and the ground was a mix of hot cinders and soft ash that swallowed footsteps. Here and there a brick wall still stood, but it was blackened and cracked, leaning dangerously. The iron rails of the streetcars were twisted into strange shapes like melted licorice. And the smell, oh, the smell! It was not just smoke. It was the smell of 100 different things burning together, wood and cloth and leather and food and, yes, flesh, but let us not dwell on that. The smell was everywhere, and it would linger for weeks until the rains came and washed the city clean. People moved through the ruins in a daze. They wore whatever they had managed to grab: blankets, torn coats, sometimes nothing but a pair of trousers. Their faces were black with soot, their eyes red and watery from the smoke. They called out names. John, Mary, is anyone here? And sometimes another voice would answer, weak and hoarse, from behind a fallen wall or from the edge of a collapsed basement. And then there would be tears and embraces, and the slow, stumbling walk toward the lake or the prairie, where the relief stations were being set up. The relief stations. That is another part of the story that deserves a gentle telling. Because as terrible as the fire was, the response of the city and the nation was remarkable. Within hours, people from nearby towns and cities were sending food, clothing, money. Trains arrived carrying supplies. The Chicago Relief and Aid Society set up tents and temporary shelters. And the people who had lost everything lined up quietly, waiting for bread and coffee and a blanket to wrap around their shoulders. There was no panic, not really. There was a kind of quiet dignity, a shared understanding that they were all in this together. One woman, an older widow who had lived on the North Side, remembered standing in line for a loaf of bread. She had lost her home, her cat, her wedding ring, everything. But she had her life and she had her hands. And as she stood there, a young man came up to her and handed her a cup of coffee. He was a stranger. He had a soot-stained face and a bandage wrapped around his hand. He said, "Ma'am, you look like you could use this." And she took it and she thanked him and she drank it slowly, letting the warmth spread through her chest. And she thought, this is what it means to be alive, to share a cup of coffee with a stranger in the middle of a ruined city. These small moments, they are the real story. Not the grand statistics, the 300 dead, the 17,000 buildings destroyed, the $200 million in damage. Those are numbers, and numbers can be cold. But the cup of coffee, the hand reaching out, the voice in the darkness, those are the things that bring the story to life, that make it something you can hold in your heart. Now let us move forward a few days. The fire had been extinguished for a week, and the city was beginning to stir. The relief efforts were in full swing. Tents had been set up in Lincoln Park and along the lakefront. People were already starting to rebuild, using whatever materials they could find. The first new buildings were simple wooden shacks, hastily constructed, but they were homes. And there was a sense of purpose in the air, a determination that Chicago would not stay down. But there were also the difficult tasks. The search for the dead, for instance. Teams of men went through the ruins, digging through the ash and debris, looking for bodies. It was grim work but necessary. They found whole families huddled together in basements where they had tried to shelter from the heat. They found people who had been trapped in collapsed buildings, their remains barely recognizable. And they found the animals, too, horses and dogs and cats, all charred and still. The workers would stop and remove their hats and offer a silent prayer and then move on. Let us not dwell on that part for too long. It is enough to know that the dead were eventually laid to rest, many in a mass grave at the city cemetery, their names recorded on a simple stone marker. The city mourned, but it did not wallow. There was too much to do. The living needed homes, jobs, schools, churches. The city had to rise again, and rise it did. But that rise was not instantaneous. It was a slow, patient process like a tree growing from a seed. The first winter after the fire was brutal. The temporary shelters were cold and drafty. The food was scarce. Many people fell sick, and yet they endured. They burned scraps of wood for warmth. They shared what little they had, and they told stories. Those stories, passed down through families and friends, kept the memory of the fire alive but also softened it. The horror became a legend, a tale to be told around the fireplace on a winter evening. "Remember the night the city burned," they would say, and the children would listen with wide eyes, imagining the flames, the smoke, the great orange sky. One of those stories, which has been told and retold for over 100 years, is about a young man named Patrick who worked as a porter at one of the hotels. When the fire started, he helped dozens of guests escape, carrying them down the stairs, leading them through the smoke, until his own clothes were singed and his lungs were burning. He finally stumbled out onto the street, coughing, and saw that the hotel was fully engulfed. He had saved many lives, but he had lost his own belongings, including a small locket with a picture of his mother. He searched for it in the ashes the next day, but of course it was gone. Years later, when the hotel was rebuilt, he returned to work there, and on the anniversary of the fire, he would tell the story to the new guests, his voice calm and steady, as if he were talking about a distant dream. That is the way of great disasters, is it not? They become part of the fabric of a place, woven into its history and its identity. Chicago is a city that was born in fire, or rather, reborn. The fire destroyed the old wooden city, and in its place, a new city of stone and steel rose up. The architects who designed the grand buildings of the late 19th century, the skyscrapers, the mansions, the public buildings, they had the fire in mind. They built with fireproof materials, and they built higher, and they built stronger. The Great Fire, as terrible as it was, became a kind of purification, a reset button that allowed the city to reinvent itself. But all of that is for another evening. For now, let us stay in the quiet aftermath, in the days and weeks after the fire. Let us walk slowly through the streets, our feet crunching on ash, our eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of green. Because life does return, it always does. The grass begins to push through the charred soil. The birds return, hesitant at first, then bold. And the people, they begin to smile again, even if the smiles are tired and fragile. There is a particular story from those early days that captures this spirit. A group of children whose families had lost everything decided to build a small playhouse out of the rubble. They collected bricks that had not cracked in the heat and boards that were only partly burned, and they assembled a tiny structure near the edge of the relief camp. They called it their castle, and they spent hours there pretending to be kings and queens, their laughter ringing out across the muddy ground. Their parents, watching from the tents, felt a warmth in their chests. If the children could play, if they could still imagine a better world, then there was hope. And that is the secret, perhaps. The fire took so much, but it could not take the imagination. It could not take the human spirit. It could not take the ability to dream. Now, as we draw near to the end of this story, let us return to the lake, to the water that saved so many. It is a calm, gray day, and the lake is still and quiet. The waves lap gently at the shore. The sand is cool and damp. And if you stand there looking out over the water, you can almost see the ghosts of that night. The thousands of people standing waist deep, their faces lit by the orange glow, their voices raised in prayer or in song or in simple conversation. They were terrified, yes, but they were also alive. And they held onto each other and onto the hope that dawn would come. And it did come. It always does. The sun rises, the fire fades, and the world continues. The story of the Great Chicago Fire is a story of destruction, but it is also a story of endurance, of the quiet strength that lies within ordinary people. And that is a story worth telling, even in the dark hours before sleep, when the mind is soft and the heart is open. Let us rest here by the lake in the stillness of the morning after. The fire is over. The smoke is clearing. The city will rebuild. And you, dear listener, have carried the story with you through the night, through the flames, and into the quiet dawn. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the memory of that night drift away like the last embers of a dying fire until there is nothing left but the gentle rhythm of your own breath and the soft whispering of the waves and the peace that comes after a long, long story. And yet, even as you begin to settle into that quiet place, the mind sometimes lingers. It wants to know a little more. It wants to see the first sparks of renewal, the first signs that life was not just surviving, but beginning to flourish again. So let us stay here just a little longer, not as a return to the fire, but as a gentle exploration of the days that followed, when the ash was still warm and the future was uncertain but full of possibility. In the weeks after the fire, the city of Chicago became a strange kind of laboratory. Not a laboratory of glass and metal and white coats, but a laboratory of human spirit and ingenuity. People experimented with shelter, with food, with community. They learned to live without the comforts they had once taken for granted. And out of that necessity, something remarkable was born. Consider the matter of housing. The temporary shelters provided by the relief committees were functional, but they were also crowded and cold. So families began to build their own homes, using whatever they could salvage from the ruins. Bricks that had survived the heat were cleaned and stacked. Beams that were only partially charred were straightened and nailed together. And in some cases, Whole walls were reconstructed from the debris of buildings that had collapsed. It was a patchwork city, a city of scraps and hope, and yet there was a certain beauty in it. Each shack, each lean-to, each tiny cabin told a story of determination. A door here from a hardware store that had burned, a window there from a church that had crumbled, a child's toy, melted and strange, used as a doorstop. These were not just buildings, they were monuments to resilience. One family, the O'Malleys, built their new home from the remains of their old one. They had lived on DeKoven Street, near where the fire had started. Their house was one of the first to burn. But they had saved a few things: a wooden chest, a set of iron pots, and a large piece of canvas that had been used as a wagon cover. With that canvas and some salvaged lumber, they erected a tent-like structure near the lake. Mrs. O'Malley hung her pots on a rope outside, and Mr. O'Malley dug a small fire pit. Their children, ages 5 and 7, gathered driftwood from the beach, and in that simple shelter they found a kind of home. The wind would whistle through the cracks at night, and the canvas would flap against the frame, but they were together. And because they were together, they were safe. It is these small, intimate details that linger in the memory, long after the grand narratives have faded. The smell of wood smoke mixing with the damp air of the lake, the sound of a mother humming a lullaby to a child who could not sleep, the sight of a father mending a broken chair, his hands blackened with soot. These are the moments that make history feel real, that turn a distant event into something you can almost touch. Now, let us turn our attention to the relief efforts, which were organized with a speed and efficiency that surprised even the most optimistic observers. Within days of the fire's end, trains began arriving in Chicago from all over the country, carrying food, clothing, and medical supplies. The cities of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia sent trainloads of goods. The state of Illinois sent its own militia to help maintain order and assist with the cleanup. And the federal government, though slow to act at first, eventually provided funds and resources. It was a national response to a local tragedy, a reminder that in times of crisis, the lines between states and cities blur, and the word neighbor extends far beyond the next house. One of the most remarkable figures in those early days was a woman named Clara Barton. You may know her name from the founding of the American Red Cross. At the time of the fire, the Red Cross was still a young organization, but Clara Barton was already a veteran of disaster relief. She arrived in Chicago on the third day after the fire, bringing with her a team of volunteers and a wagon load of supplies. She set up a distribution center in a tent near the courthouse, and she personally oversaw the distribution of food, clothing, and medicine to thousands of people. She worked from dawn until well past midnight, her voice gentle but firm, her hands steady as she handed out blankets and bandages. People remembered her calm presence, the way she looked them in the eye and asked their names. She did not treat them as victims. She treated them as survivors. And that small act of dignity meant more than any amount of bread or cloth. There is a story told about Clara Barton during those days. She was walking through the rubble, checking on the families in the temporary shelters, when she came across a young woman sitting alone, her face buried in her hands. Clara sat down beside her and did not speak. After a long moment, the woman looked up and said, "I have lost everything, my home, my husband, even my sewing machine. I do not know how I will go on." Clara listened, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small coin. It was a silver dollar, worn smooth from handling. She pressed it into the woman's palm and said, "This is not much, but it is something. And tomorrow there will be something else. And the day after that there will be something more. You will not go on alone." The woman closed her fingers around the coin and began to cry. But this time they were tears of relief, not despair. She kept that silver dollar for the rest of her life, and when she told the story to her grandchildren, she always said, it was not the money that mattered, it was the knowing that someone cared. And so the days passed, each one bringing a little more light, a little more order. The streets were cleared of the worst debris. The bodies were buried. The search for missing persons continued, but the lists of the dead grew shorter, and the lists of the living grew longer. People began to think not just about survival, but about the future. They began to plan. One of the first decisions the city leaders made was to ban the construction of wooden buildings within the downtown area. It was a simple rule, but it changed the face of the city forever. From that point on, new buildings had to be built of brick, stone, or iron. And that decision, born from the ashes of the fire, gave Chicago its distinctive skyline. The city that rose from the rubble was not a city of wooden shacks and fragile storefronts. It was a city of solid, enduring structures. It was a city built to withstand not just fire but time itself. The architects and builders who flocked to Chicago in the years after the fire were some of the most innovative of their age. They experimented with new techniques, new materials, new designs. They built taller than anyone had ever built before. They built stronger, with iron frames and fireproof walls. They built beautiful, with ornate facades and grand lobbies. And in doing so, they created a city that became a symbol of American ambition and resilience. You have probably heard of the Home Insurance Building, completed in 1A Tateviv. It is often called the first skyscraper, a 10-story tower of iron and masonry that seemed to scrape the sky. But before that, there were many smaller experiments, many quiet triumphs of engineering, and each one in its own way was a response to the fire. The fire had shown what could be lost in a single night. The new buildings were a way of saying, we will not lose this again. We will make it safe. We will make it last. But let us not get too caught up in the architecture and the statistics. Let us return for a moment to the human scale, to the lives that were lived within those walls. Because the story of the Great Fire is not just a story of a city. It is a story of people, ordinary people, doing extraordinary things. There was a baker named Herr Schmidt who lost his bakery on Randolph Street. He had been making bread for 20 years, and his loaves were known throughout the neighborhood for their golden crust and soft, chewy crumb. When the fire came, he tried to save his oven, but the heat was too intense. He fled with only a sack of flour and a tin of yeast. For the first few weeks, he helped in the relief kitchens, kneading dough by hand and baking loaves in makeshift ovens made from salvaged bricks. The bread he made was not as good as his old bread, he said, because the oven was not the same. But the people who ate it did not complain. They were grateful for anything warm and filling. And Herr Schmidt, seeing the smiles on their faces, began to think that perhaps his new bread, born from ashes and scarcity, had a flavor all its own. It was the flavor of community, of shared hardship, of hope. He eventually rebuilt his bakery, this time with a brick oven and a stone floor. And on the anniversary of the fire every year for the rest of his life, he would bake 100 loaves of bread and give them away for free. He would stand at the door of his shop, his apron white with flour, and hand a loaf to anyone who passed by. For the memory, he would say, so we never forget. And the people would take the bread, warm and fragrant, and they would remember. They would remember the night of fire, but also the morning after, when a stranger had given them something to eat. This is the thread that runs through all the stories of the Great Chicago Fire. It is a thread of generosity, of kindness, of the small acts that make a disaster bearable. And it is that thread that we hold on to, even as we let the rest of the story fade into the soft silence of a sleeping mind. So now, let us let the story settle. Let us imagine ourselves sitting on the shore of Lake Michigan, the water lapping gently at our feet. The sun is low in the sky, casting long shadows across the sand. Behind us, the city is rising, brick by brick, stone by stone. But ahead of us, there is only water and peace and the quiet rhythm of the waves. We have traveled far tonight. We have walked through flames and through ash. We have seen the fear and the courage, the despair and the hope. And now we rest. Breathe in the cool night air. Feel the ground beneath you, solid and steady. The fire is over. The city is rebuilding. And you are here in this moment, safe and warm, drifting towards sleep. Let the images of the story dissolve, one by one, like sparks fading in the dark. Let your thoughts become soft, formless, like the clouds that drift across the moon. There is nothing left to hold on to. There is nothing left to fear. Close your eyes, let your breathing slow. And as you sink deeper into the quiet, know that the story will be here when you return, waiting for you like an old friend who never rushes, who never demands. It is just a story after all. And stories, like fires, eventually burn down to embers. And embers in time become ash. And ash returns to the earth where new things grow. So rest now. The night is long and gentle. And the dawn will come in its own time, bringing light and warmth and a new day. But for now, there is only this: the sound of your breath, the beat of your heart, and the soft whisper of a world that has found its peace. Good night, dear listener. Sleep well. The story is over and you are exactly where you need to be. But perhaps the story is never truly over. It lingers in the air like the scent of smoke after a campfire, faint and far away, but still present if you know how to listen. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes of that night in the wind off Lake Michigan, in the creak of old brick walls, in the quiet that settles over the city in the small hours before dawn. So let us stay here a little longer. Let us drift back into the narrative, not with a rush, but with the ease of a boat returning to shore after a long, peaceful sail. There is a detail about the rebuilding that is often overlooked. one that speaks to the quiet tenacity of the people who called Chicago home. In the days immediately after the fire, while the ash was still warm, the city's leaders gathered in a small room above a saloon that had somehow survived the flames. They did not have a table, so they used a wooden door propped on two barrels. They did not have proper chairs, so they sat on crates and stacks of salvaged lumber. And they did not have a map of the city because the map had burned along with everything else. So one of the men, a surveyor named Edward, drew a rough outline of the streets from memory, using a piece of charcoal on the back of a torn bedsheet. It was not accurate, he admitted. The lines were crooked, the angles wrong, but it was enough. It gave them a starting point. They decided that very night that the city would not just be rebuilt, but rebuilt better. They would widen the streets. They would create a system of parks and boulevards. They would mandate that all new buildings be fireproof, or at least as fireproof as human ingenuity could make them. And they would do it all without waiting for permission or funding from the state or federal government. They would do it themselves because that is what Chicagoans did. They did not wait for help, they built. And so the work began. It was not glamorous. It was not thrilling. It was slow, methodical, and often frustrating. But day by day, brick by brick, the city took shape. And as it did, something remarkable happened. People from all over the country began to notice. They saw the photographs in newspapers, the sketches in magazines, the stories in letters from relatives. They saw a city that had been reduced to nothing, and they saw that city rising again, taller and stronger than before. And they wanted to be part of it. The population of Chicago had been about 300,000 before the fire. Within a decade, it had more than doubled. People came from the farms of the Midwest, from the factories of the East, from the villages of Europe. They came because they had heard that in Chicago, a person could start over. They came because they had heard that in Chicago, the streets were paved with opportunity. And while that was not strictly true, it was close enough to the truth to draw them in. One of those newcomers was a young man named Oscar, who arrived from Sweden with nothing but a toolbox and a photograph of his mother. He had trained as a carpenter in Stockholm, but in Chicago he found work as a bricklayer, because that was what the city needed most. Every morning he would wake before sunrise, eat a bowl of oatmeal, and walk to the construction site. He would lay bricks all day, his hands growing rough and calloused, his back aching. And in the evening he would return to the boarding house where he shared a room with 3 other men, and he would write letters home, describing the city he was helping to build. In one of those letters he wrote, "The buildings here are like trees. They grow upward, reaching for the sky, and I am one of the hands that plants them." He did not think of himself as a hero. He did not think of himself as part of history. He was just a man doing his job. But years later, when his granddaughter visited Chicago and saw the old buildings along LaSalle Street, she would point to the brickwork and say, "My grandfather laid that. He was here. He helped." That is the thing about rebuilding. It is not done by famous architects or wealthy philanthropists alone. It is done by thousands of ordinary hands, each one adding a small piece to the whole. And those hands leave their mark, even if no one remembers their names. Let us visit one of those buildings now in our imagination. It is not a skyscraper. It is a modest two-story structure on a corner lot built of red brick with white stone trim. A sign above the door reads Schmidt's Bakery, and inside the air is warm and fragrant with yeast and sugar. Herr Schmidt is at the counter, his hands in the dough, his face flushed from the heat of the oven. He glances up as the door opens and he smiles. He knows his customers by name. He knows their children, their jobs, their troubles. And he knows that every loaf of bread he sells is a small act of normalcy, a return to the rhythms of daily life. The bakery is not the only business to reopen. Down the street, a dry goods store is doing a brisk trade in blankets and pots and pans. A blacksmith has set up a forge in a temporary shelter, hammering out hinges and nails as fast as his arm can swing. A tailor sits cross-legged on the floor of a half-finished shop, sewing patches onto shirts and trousers. It is not a grand economic revival. It is a slow, humble recovery, one stitch at a time, one nail at a time, one loaf at a time. And yet, even in this quiet progress, there are moments of unexpected beauty. One afternoon, a young woman named Anna, who had lost her entire family in the fire, walked past a construction site and saw a worker carving a stone. He was not a sculptor. He was just a mason, shaping a piece of limestone to fit into a wall. But as he worked, he sang a hymn in a language she did not recognize. The melody was simple, almost childlike. Anna stopped and listened. She did not understand the words, but she understood the feeling. It was a feeling of patience, faith, and stubborn hope. She stood there for a long time, her arms wrapped around herself, tears streaming down her cheeks. And when the mason finished the stone and moved on to the next one, she wiped her eyes and walked home. She did not tell anyone what had happened, but she began to sing that hymn in her own language, quietly, while she worked at the relief kitchen. And other women heard her and they began to hum along. And soon, the kitchen was filled with a chorus of soft, broken voices, singing of a tomorrow that had not yet arrived but was already being built. These are the moments that do not make it into the history books. They are too small, too fleeting, but they are the true foundation of the city. Not the steel frames or the stone facades, but the songs sung in the rubble, the bread shared among strangers, the hands that reached out in the dark. Now let us step back and take a broader view. Let us imagine the skyline of Chicago as it looked in the late 1880s, about 15 years after the fire. The city has changed dramatically. The wooden shacks are gone. In their place stand buildings of brick and iron, some rising 10, 12, even 15 stories. The streets are wider, straighter, lined with trees. There are parks, public squares, and a grand boulevard called Michigan Avenue that runs along the lakefront. At night, gas lamps cast a soft orange glow on the sidewalks. People walk home from work, their footsteps echoing on the pavement. There is a sense of order, of permanence that did not exist before the fire. But even in this new city, the memory of the fire is never far away. Every building has a story of what was lost and what was rebuilt. Every family has a tale of escape or survival. And every year on the anniversary of the fire, the city holds a moment of silence. The bells of the churches ring once, twice, 3 times, and for that brief moment the entire city stops. The streetcars pause, the shoppers halt in their tracks, the factory workers fall still, and everyone thinks of that night, of the wind and the flames, and of the morning after when the sun rose on a world of ash. But then the moment passes. The bells stop ringing. The streetcars start again. The shoppers continue on their way, and life goes on as it always does. And now, dear listener, we find ourselves once again at the shore of Lake Michigan. The sun has set and the stars are coming out, one by one, like candles lit in a vast, silent cathedral. The water is dark and still, reflecting the lights of the city in 1,000 tiny ripples. You are sitting on a blanket or perhaps on a smooth stone, the cool sand between your toes. There is a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wet earth and fresh grass. And in the distance, you hear the low rumble of a train heading west, its whistle a long, mournful note that fades into the night. You have walked through the fire. You have seen the fear and the courage, the despair and the hope. And now you are here in this peaceful place watching the stars. There is nothing left to do but breathe. In, out, in, out. Each breath brings you deeper into calm, deeper into rest. Let your thoughts drift like the clouds above. Let them become soft and shapeless. There is no need to hold on to anything. The story has been told. The city has been rebuilt. And you are safe, warm, and loved. So close your eyes. Let the sound of the water carry you. Let the gentle rhythm of the waves match the rhythm of your heart. And as you drift toward sleep, know that you are part of this story too. You are the one who listened. You are the one who remembered. And that in its own quiet way is a kind of rebuilding. Rest now. The night is yours, and the dawn will come as it always does, bringing new light, new warmth, and a new day. But for now there is only this, the soft whisper of the lake, the gentle hum of the city at rest, and the steady, peaceful rhythm of your own breath. Good night. Sleep well. And may your dreams be as calm as the still water under a starry sky. And yet before the city could rise again, it had to fall first. Let us return to that night, but this time, not through the eyes of any single person, but through the air itself. Imagine you are a bird, if you will. Not a real bird with feathers and bones and a frantic little heart, but a bird of the mind. A gentle, imaginary creature that can float above the streets of Chicago on the evening of October 8th, 1871. You are not afraid. You are simply watching. Below you, the city spreads out like a patchwork quilt, a jumble of wooden houses and narrow alleys, of church steeples and factory chimneys. The streets are crowded with horse-drawn wagons and people hurrying home. The sun has set and the gaslights are beginning to glow, soft yellow pools that cast long shadows. There is a smell of coal smoke and cooking fires, of hay and horse manure, of the lake water and the muddy streets. It is a familiar smell, a comfortable smell, the smell of a busy city settling in for the night. But there is something else in the air tonight, a taste of dryness, a crackle. The summer had been long and hot, and the autumn had brought no rain. The wooden sidewalks, the wooden roofs, the wooden fences, they are all tinder, waiting for a spark. And as you float higher, you can see the whole city laid out before you, a grid of streets that stretches from the lake to the prairie. It looks solid, permanent. But you know, even in your imaginary bird mind, that it is not. It is fragile, temporary, a collection of matchsticks. Now, let us descend a little down toward the west side, where the fire is said to have begun. There is a small barn behind a house on DeKoven Street. The barn is old, rickety, filled with hay and straw. Inside, a cow stirs in her sleep. Earlier that evening, a woman named Catherine O'Leary had come out to milk her cow. She had carried a kerosene lamp, and some say the cow kicked it over. Others say it was a neighbor's boy sneaking a cigarette. No one knows for sure. What we know is that around 9 o'clock, flames licked up from the barn, and within minutes the barn was engulfed. Catherine O'Leary shouted for her husband, Patrick. He came running with a bucket of water, but it was too little, too late. The fire spread to the house, then to the neighbor's house, then to the next block. The wind was strong from the southwest, driving the flames northeast straight into the heart of the city. And now, if you were that imaginary bird, you would see something remarkable. The fire did not travel as a single wall of flame. It leaped. It jumped from roof to roof, from fence to fence, sometimes landing blocks ahead, starting new fires that would grow and merge. It moved faster than a man could run. And it was hot, so hot that the air itself seemed to shimmer. People would later tell stories of the roar of the fire, a sound like 1,000 freight trains, a deep, hungry rumble that shook the ground. And the light, the entire sky turned orange, then red, then white. You could read a newspaper by that light, they said. You could see your own shadow cast by the flames. But let us not get too caught up in the excitement. We are here for a sleepy story, not a nightmare, so let us slow down. Let us watch from a distance, from the safety of our blanket on the lake shore. The fire is far away now, a memory, a tale. And yet, if we listen closely, we can still hear the echoes, not the screams, not the panic, but the quieter sounds. The sound of a child's toy dropped in the street, the sound of a door left swinging on its hinges, the sound of water boiling in a cistern. These are the sounds that linger long after the flames have died. Now let me tell you about a man named William. He was not a hero. He was a bookkeeper, thin and bespectacled, with ink stains on his fingers. On the night of the fire, he was working late in his office on Lake Street, trying to balance the books for a wholesale grocer. He heard shouts from the street, looked out the window, and saw the sky glowing red. He grabbed his hat, his coat, and a leather satchel filled with ledgers. He ran down the stairs and out into the street. The wind was fierce, whipping his coat around his legs. He could feel the heat on his face even from blocks away. He did not think, he just ran. He ran north toward the river because everyone said the river would stop the fire, but the river did not stop it. The fire leaped across like a dancer trailing sparks. William kept running, his legs burning, his lungs aching. He passed a woman clutching a baby, a man pushing a wheelbarrow full of furniture, a dog barking wildly. He did not stop. He could not stop. Finally, he reached the lake where thousands of people had gathered, standing in the shallow water watching their city burn. He waded in up to his knees. He held his satchel above his head, and he wept. Later, he would learn that his office building had been destroyed along with all the records, but the ledgers in his satchel survived. They were water-stained and smudged, but they were legible. The grocer was able to reopen, thanks to those ledgers. And William, who had never thought of himself as brave, became a quiet hero. Not the kind that gets a statue, but the kind that gets a handshake and a thank you. And that, in its own way, is enough. Let us sit with William for a moment in the cold lake water watching the flames. He is shivering, exhausted, his heart pounding, but he is safe. And around him others are safe too. Families huddled together, strangers sharing blankets, children crying, then falling asleep. It is a strange kind of community born of disaster. For that one night everyone was equal. Rich and poor, native and immigrant all stood together in the water, watching the same fire. And now let us drift forward in time a few days after the fire. The embers are still smoldering, but the city is already stirring. Let us visit a man named Joseph, a Swedish immigrant we met briefly before, but let us see him more closely now. He is standing in front of a heap of rubble that used to be his home. He is not crying. He is not angry. He is simply looking, his hands in his pockets, his jaw set. He has been in America for 2 years. He has worked as a bricklayer, a carpenter, a laborer. He has saved every penny he could, sending most of it home to his family. Now everything is gone. The boarding house, the tools, the letters, the photograph of his mother, all ash. But Joseph is not a man who gives up. He is a man who builds. So he walks to the relief station, collects a loaf of bread and a blanket, and then he walks to the waterfront where the ships are unloading lumber. He finds a foreman and asks for work. The foreman looks at his calloused hands and nods. That afternoon, Joseph is hauling planks, carrying nails, helping to build a temporary shelter. He does not think about the future. He does not plan. He just works. And that is how the city is rebuilt, one man at a time, one plank at a time. Now let us consider the role of women in the rebuilding. They are often overlooked in the history books, but they were essential. Let us visit a woman named Clara, a widow in her 50s. She had lost her husband 2 years before the fire, and she had supported herself by taking in laundry. After the fire, she had nothing. Her house was gone, her customers were scattered, her washing board was a pile of charred wood. She sat on the curb, her hands folded in her lap, and watched the wagons go by. She did not know what to do. She had no money, no family, no home. But then she saw a group of women setting up a soup kitchen in a tent. She walked over hesitantly and asked if she could help. The women welcomed her. They put a ladle in her hand and set her to work stirring a pot of beans. She stirred all day until her arm ached. But at the end of the day, she ate a bowl of soup, and she felt something she had not felt in years: purpose. She came back the next day and the next. She learned to cook in large quantities, to manage supplies, to comfort the hungry. Within a month, she was running the kitchen herself. And when the relief effort ended, she used her savings, what little she had, to open a small boarding house for working women. She called it the Home Again. And for years, women who had lost everything would find shelter there: a warm bed, a hot meal, a kind word. Clara never remarried. She never became rich. But she helped rebuild the city in her own way, one meal at a time, one bed at a time. Let us pause and think about that. The great buildings of Chicago, the skyscrapers, the department stores, the grand hotels, they were built by men like Joseph, with brick and steel and stone. But the heart of the city, the soul of it, was rebuilt by women like Clara, with soup and patience and hope. Both were necessary, both were heroic. Now let us visit another scene a few years later. It is 1873 and the city is in the midst of a building boom. The streets are filled with the sound of hammers and saws, of horses pulling wagons loaded with bricks, of men shouting orders. And there, on the corner of Randolph and La Salle, a new building is rising. It is the first steel-framed skyscraper in the world, the Home Insurance Building. It is 10 stories tall, a height that seems impossible, like a Tower of Babel. People come from miles away just to gawk at it. They stand on the sidewalk, craning their necks, shading their eyes. They do not know it yet, but this building will change everything. It will change the way cities look, the way they feel. It is a monument to the future. But even as the skyscrapers rise, the city remembers the fire. The building codes are strict now. No more wooden roofs, no more shoddy construction. Every building must be fireproof, or at least fire-resistant. And there are fire hydrants on every corner, and a new water system drawn from the lake, and a professional fire department with steam engines and trained men. The city has learned its lesson, and yet there is a melancholy in the air, a quiet sadness that lingers. The old Chicago is gone, the wooden city of crowded neighborhoods and crooked streets. The new Chicago is grander, safer, more modern, but it is also colder somehow. The warmth of the old wooden houses, the intimacy of the narrow alleys, the chaos of the tenements, all of that has been replaced by order and efficiency. And the people, too, have changed. They have become harder, more determined, but also more careful. They do not take risks. They do not leave lamps unattended. They do not build without permits. And yet they still dream. They still hope. They still sing in the relief kitchens, and they still lay bricks with their bare hands. One evening, a young couple is walking along Michigan Avenue, looking up at the new buildings. They are recent arrivals, freshly married, full of dreams. The husband squeezes his wife's hand and says, "One day we will have a shop on this street with a glass front and a sign in gold letters." She smiles, but she does not answer. She is thinking of the fire. She has heard the stories. She knows what can happen. But she also knows that this city is made of people who refuse to give up. And so she nods and she squeezes his hand back, and they walk on into the gathering dusk. Now let us look at the lake again. The water is still. The stars are out. You have been listening for a long time and your eyelids are heavy. Let us take a deep breath together. Inhale. Exhale. Feel the cool air fill your lungs, then release it slowly. There is no rush. The story is not going anywhere. It will wait for you, as patient as the lake. Let me tell you one more small story, a very small one, about a boy named Thomas. Thomas was 10 years old when the fire happened. He lived with his parents in a small house near the river. On the night of the fire, his father woke him up, wrapped him in a blanket, and carried him outside. The sky was red, and the air was filled with sparks. Thomas was terrified. He buried his face in his father's shoulder and squeezed his eyes shut. His father ran, his boots pounding on the wooden sidewalk, his breath coming in short gasps. They reached the river and his father waded in, holding Thomas above the water. The sparks fell around them, hissing as they hit the water. Thomas opened his eyes and saw the city burning. He never forgot that sight. Years later, when Thomas was a grown man, he became a firefighter. He joined the Chicago Fire Department and served for 40 years. He fought countless fires, saved countless lives. But every time he saw a fire, he remembered that night. He remembered the smell, the heat, the fear. And he used that memory to keep himself alert, to never become complacent. When he retired, he gave a speech at a ceremony. He said, "I have fought fires in this city for 4 decades. I have seen buildings collapse, families lose everything. But I have also seen the strength of this city. I have seen people rebuild. I have seen hope rise from the ashes, and I am proud to have been a part of that." Then he sat down and the audience applauded. And then they all went home to their warm houses, their safe streets, their modern city. And now, dear listener, we are approaching the end of our journey. But not quite the end, because the story never truly ends. The city is still there, still growing, still changing. And you are still here, drifting in the darkness, warm and safe. The fire is a memory now, a story passed down through generations. It has become part of the city's bones. Let us imagine one last scene. It is 100 years after the fire in 1971. The city of Chicago is holding a commemoration. A crowd gathers at the site where the O'Leary barn once stood. There is a small plaque now set into the ground. People are quiet, respectful. A choir sings. A priest offers a prayer. And then a woman steps forward. She is old, in her 90s, with silver hair and a cane. She is the granddaughter of Catherine O'Leary. She speaks softly, but the crowd listens. She says, "My grandmother was blamed for something she did not do. She was a kind woman, a hard-working woman. She loved her cow. She loved her family. And she never forgave herself, even though the fire was not her fault. I want you to know, all of you, that she is not responsible. The wind is responsible. The drought is responsible. The wooden buildings are responsible. But most of all, the lack of rain, the lack of luck. My grandmother died a broken woman, and I hope that now, 100 years later, we can finally let her rest." And the crowd is silent. Then a few people begin to clap, then more, until the applause fills the air. And the old woman smiles, a small, sad smile, and she walks away, leaning on her cane. So you see, even the story of the fire is not simple. It is a story of blame and forgiveness, of shame and redemption. It is a human story full of flaws and grace. And now let us return to the lake. The moon has risen, a thin crescent like a smile in the sky. The water is dark, but the moonlight dances on the surface, making tiny silver paths. You are warm, wrapped in your blanket, the sand soft beneath you. The fire is far away in time and in space. It cannot touch you here. You are safe. Take a breath. Let go of the story. Let it drift away like smoke on a breeze. The only thing that matters now is this moment, this stillness, this peace. Close your eyes. Listen to the water. It is singing a lullaby, older than any city, older than any fire. It is the sound of the earth itself, patient and eternal, Rest now. Sleep well. And when you wake, the world will be bright and new, and you will carry this story with you. A quiet memory, a gentle tale of a city that burned and rose again. And yet, even as the words fade and your eyes grow heavier, there is one more scene that I almost forgot to tell you. It is a small scene, almost invisible like a thread of smoke rising from a long cold fire. But it matters because it shows how the memory of that night never really leaves a place. It settles into the cracks, into the soil, into the very stones of the city. Let us travel back to 1923, 52 years after the fire. The city is now a giant, a roaring beast of industry and commerce. The skyscrapers have multiplied, the streets are thick with automobiles and streetcars, and the lakefront is lined with parks and beaches. Chicago has become the second largest city in the nation, a place of power and ambition. And yet, on a quiet street in the near Southwest Side, there is a small museum. It is housed in an old wooden firehouse, one of the few buildings that survived the fire. The museum is dedicated to the fire itself. It contains photographs, melted glass, a clock that stopped at 1:30, the exact moment the fire reached the courthouse. There are charred timbers and twisted iron, and a single unbroken teacup that was found in the ashes of a house on Jefferson Street. The curator is an elderly man named Mr. Henderson. He has been tending this museum for 30 years, ever since he retired from the fire department. He knows every artifact by heart. He can tell you the story behind each one, the names of the families who owned them, the places they came from. He does not give lectures. He simply opens the doors each morning, sits in a wooden chair by the window and waits. Sometimes school children come, giggling and restless. He shows them the melted glass and they fall silent. Sometimes old couples come, walking slowly, holding hands. They remember stories their grandparents told them. They stand before the stopped clock and whisper to each other. One afternoon, a young man enters the museum. He is a journalist from New York, writing a series of articles about great urban disasters. He has a notebook and a camera. He asks Mr. Henderson many questions. What caused the fire? Was Mrs. O'Leary really to blame? How many died? Mr. Henderson answers patiently, but after a while he stops. He says, "Young man, you are asking the wrong questions. The fire is not about blame or numbers. It is about what happens inside people when they lose everything. It is about the moment a man realizes that all he owns is a blanket and the clothes on his back. It is about a woman who emerges from the ruins holding her child, and she is grateful that the child is alive. That is the story. The rest is just details." The journalist nods, writes something in his notebook, and leaves. Mr. Henderson watches him go, then returns to his chair. He looks out the window. The street is busy, full of life. He thinks about the silence that followed the fire, the strange stillness of the ruined city. He remembers hearing that in the days after, you could hear a bird singing from blocks away because there were no walls to block the sound. He shakes his head slowly, then closes his eyes for a moment. That evening, after the museum closes, Mr. Henderson walks home. He lives in a small apartment above a bakery on Taylor Street. The smell of fresh bread drifts up through the floorboards. He makes himself a cup of tea, sits by the window, and watches the lights come on across the city. He thinks about all the fires he has fought, all the lives he has seen changed. He thinks about the fire that started this all, and he wonders if the people today in their steel and stone buildings remember how fragile it all is. He hopes they do, but he also hopes they are not afraid, because fear is not the lesson. The lesson is gratitude. Gratitude for the water, the air, the ground beneath your feet. Gratitude for the people who hold your hand in the darkness. Now let us return to the lake for the last time. The moon is higher now, and the stars are scattered like seeds across the sky. The water laps gently at the shore, a soft, rhythmic whisper. You are still here, wrapped in warmth, floating in the quiet. The story has unfolded, and now it is folding back into itself, like a wave receding into the deep. There is one more image I want to leave with you. It is not a dramatic image. It is simple. Imagine a single brick lying on the ground in a vacant lot near the intersection of Dukoven and Jefferson. That brick is all that remains of the O'Leary barn. Not the original brick, of course. That one was destroyed. But a replacement placed there by a historian a few decades ago as a marker. It is a plain red brick, unremarkable. People walk past it every day without noticing. Sometimes children pick it up and toss it aside. But if you were to sit beside that brick, late at night when the streets are empty, you might sense something. A faint warmth, as if the fire still smolders deep underground. A whisper of wind that smells faintly of smoke. It is not real, of course. It is just your imagination feeding on the stories you have heard. And yet it is enough, because stories are not just words. They are seeds. They take root in the mind and grow, branching out, connecting to other stories, forming a hidden forest of memory. And this story, the story of the Great Chicago Fire, is one of the oldest and strongest trees in that forest. It has roots that reach back to the wooden sidewalks and the crowded tenements, and branches that stretch forward into the future, shading the skyscrapers and the boulevards. And you, dear listener, have now added your own memory to that forest. You have walked through the flames, you have stood on the shore, you have heard the cow's gentle lowing and the father's urgent footsteps. You have seen the city rise again, and you have felt the sadness of what was lost. But you have also felt the hope. And that hope is what remains long after the story ends. So now let the story dissolve. Let the images fade like embers dying one by one. You are no longer in Chicago. You are in your own room, in your own bed, in your own quiet night. The blanket is soft, the pillow is cool. Your breathing is slow and deep. The fire is only a flicker in the distance, a star that has already set. Close your eyes. Let the darkness wrap around you like a gentle hand. There is nothing more to hear, nothing more to remember. Only the silence, vast and kind, and the steady rhythm of your own heart. Sleep now. Sleep deeply. And when morning comes, you will wake refreshed, with a quiet story tucked away in the corner of your mind like a faded photograph in an old album. It will not disturb you. It will simply be there, a reminder of the night the city burned and the dawn that followed. Rest well and sweet dreams. And yet, even as you drift toward that gentle darkness, let me whisper one last thing. It is not a story, not really. It is more like a feeling, a soft echo that lingers in the quiet of the night. You see, the great fire left behind more than ashes and rebuilt walls. It left behind a kind of silence, a silence that you can still find if you know where to look. Have you ever walked through an old city late at night when the streets are empty and the streetlights cast long, lazy shadows? Perhaps you have felt it then, a stillness that is not quite empty, a sense that the ground beneath your feet remembers something. The footsteps of thousands who fled, the heat that rose from the cobblestones, the crackle of flames that sounded like 1,000 hungry mouths. That memory does not fade. It settles into the earth, into the bricks, into the very air. And on a quiet night, if you listen closely, you might hear it, not with your ears, with something deeper. A quiet hum, like the distant drone of a sleeping city. There is a place, not far from where the fire began, where an old elm tree stands in a small public garden. It was planted in the spring of 1872, just a few months after the fire. The city had decided to put a garden there, on a vacant lot that had once held a row of tenements. The soil was still black with ash. The workers dug deep, turning over the earth, and they found a child's shoe, a melted spoon, and a single copper penny, so warped by heat that it looked like a dried leaf. They buried those things again, tossed in some compost, and planted the sapling. That tree grew slowly at first, as if it were testing the soil, making sure it was safe. But it did grow. And now, more than 150 years later, its branches stretch wide, casting a shade that seems deeper than it should be, as if it holds the darkness of that night within its leaves. On a calm evening in early autumn, you might sit on a bench beneath that tree. The air is cool, the leaves rustle softly, and the city hums in the distance. You might close your eyes and feel the breeze on your face. And for just a moment, you might imagine the smell of smoke, faint and far away, like a memory that belongs to someone else. That is the fire, still breathing, still whispering, but no longer a threat. It has become a part of the fabric of the place, like the grain in an old wooden table. And now, dear listener, it is time to let go of that whisper too. The tree will keep its vigil. The lake will keep its rhythm. The brick will lie in the vacant lot, warm with imagined heat. But you need not carry it any further. You have already held it long enough. So release it. Let it drift away like a leaf floating down a slow river, growing smaller and smaller until it disappears around a bend. You are in your own room again. The sheets are cool and soft against your skin. The darkness around you is thick and safe, like a blanket that has been warmed by the sun. Your breath comes slow and easy, a gentle tide in the stillness of your chest. There is no fire here, no smoke, no hurry, only the quiet rhythm of the night and the steady beat of your heart, counting the moments until sleep. Rest now, rest deeply. The story has been told, and it has found a home in the quiet corners of your mind. Let it settle there like a photograph tucked into an old book, waiting to be discovered on some other gentle night. But for now, there is only the soft, endless dark and the peace that comes when all the words have been said. Sleep well, Sleep soundly. And when morning comes, may it bring you calm and light and the simple joy of a new day. Good night.